Thank you, and thank you all for coming back. It seems like we have pretty much all the attendees we had during the first round, which means I didn't do enough to scare everybody away, which is, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but um, I want to pick up where we left off with on Monday and kind of keep building on this report and this theme, and then start integrating it into Counterpoint. And then what we'll do is we'll spend kind of uh, roughly 20 minutes of today's portion calling up existing Counterpoint reports and existing Counterpoint invoice forms or purchase order forms to make tweaks and modifications to those as well, so you can see how that works. If anybody has any questions that they want to jump in with from some of the stuff we covered on Monday to clarify anything before we move on, I'll give you a minute or two before we start really getting a lot of new material. And so where we left off on Monday, I'm going to take us to the design tab just to kind of catch up or reiterate what we've done. Is we built a report based on items in inventory. And based on those items in inventory, we calculated the retail value of our inventory. We calculated the gross margin percentage of our on-hand inventory. And we grouped that inventory, well, it was all detailed by location or location specific. And then we grouped it by item number and then by category. And so with the item group and with the category group, we were able to accumulate running totals or subtotals for the on-hand inventory and the retail value. And then we introduced sales history, which kind of threw a monkey wrench into our report in that it had a negative impact on our running totals or our summaries of our on-hand and our retail value of inventory, because it was calculating or adding the on-hand inventory for every transaction where the item was sold. So if the item was sold 10 times, our on-hand inventory would be 10 times higher. Same thing with the retail value. So what we had done was we converted our on-hand summaries from summaries to running totals, where we were able to control when those were added based on the change of the location. And so that kind of got us back on track with accurate totals of on-hand inventory and a total for the quantity sold. And so at this point, if we were to execute this report, it would show us what we have on hand, what it's worth, and how many we've sold over the life of the product. And that may not really satisfy our interests. We might want to know, how many did I sell this season or this week or this year or over the last 3 years? And so what we want to add to this is the ability to filter our data by date range. And there's two ways in which we can do this. So when we incorporate this report into Counterpoint, when we look at the report in Counterpoint, it's going to have an item tab, an inventory tab, and a ticket history line tab. And we could filter that on the Counterpoint side using the posting date or that business date, which will appear as the posting date in Counterpoint. So we could filter the data by the business date or posting date and get an accurate total of what was sold during the time frame. But the problem with that is going to be, if we do that, and I'll demonstrate this a little bit later once we get this over to Counterpoint, we talked on Monday about how we're linking tables. And when we linked in that ticket history table, we said we wanted to make that a left join, meaning we want all of our item and inventory information, and if we've sold it, we want that as well. Well, the problem is, if we filter based on the posting date from Counterpoint, that's going to effectively change that left outer join to an inner join, which means we are only going to see items in inventory for products that we've sold. And that could cause a big problem, because if we've just received something that's brand new, we'd want to know about it even if we haven't sold it yet. So I want to maintain that left outer join. And so what I'm going to do is, instead of having the end user filter based on the ticket history tab, I want to give them parameters. And we're going to add 3 different parameters to this report. The first 2 are going to be a starting date and an ending date, probably the most 2 common parameters used on any report. And then we're going to do another one where we can conditionally print or suppress information on the report. So I'm going to go ahead and add a parameter. So I'll click on parameters and hit the new button. And my parameter is going to be start date. And the type of parameter is going to be a date. And then down below it says prompting text, and enter start date looks okay, but I'm going to get rid of that underscore so it looks a little more official. And what your parameter creation screen looks like will depend upon what version of Crystal Reports you're running, but they'll all effectively provide those same things. What's the prompting text, what's the data type, and what's the field name. So I've got my starting date, and I'm going to do the same thing for my ending date. So end date, and it's going to be a date type field. And the end user will see enter end date. And now what I'm going to do is, I don't want to filter the data in Counterpoint, or in Crystal Report Writer, which I could do. I could create a filter based on the date range being between the starting and the ending date. But I don't want to do that because, again, that's going to change my join type from a left join to an inner join. So what I want to do is I want to change this quantity sold, and I want to make a formula for the quantity sold. And what we're going to do is we're going to evaluate, was this sold during our time frame? If it was sold during our time frame, we'll add the quantity sold. If not, we won't. So basically, we're building a summary of the quantity sold based on whether or not it was sold during our selected time frame. So I'm going to build a formula for the quantity sold. And so I might call this something like period quantity sold. And so when I name things, I usually like to try and name them something specific to what they are, and different than the normal field. So I might abbreviate sold as SLD. So if I'm just looking at it quickly, I can tell the difference between the field of quantity sold and my variable. And so now I'm going to build a field, and this is going to be a little bit like that division we did the other day, where we said if the denominator isn't 0, do the division. But in this case, the if statement is going to be, is the date in the range? So we're going to use that if statement, and I'm going to point this to the posting date. So if the posting date is greater than or equal to my starting date, and my posting date is less than or equal my end date, then we're going to accumulate a total of the quantity sold. There we are. If the transaction date isn't in the range, we're going to output a 0. So essentially, we're building a column of either a 0 or the quantity sold, and then when we add that column down, we'll get a sum of how many were sold in the period. And so I'm going to Let me do something else here that I wanted to do all along, and this would be a good time to do it, mostly because I'm running out of space on the page. One of the things that many of you will want to do with your reports is make them wider. So you can landscape them on the page so you can fit more columns, especially if you're going to be outputting to Excel. So if I go to File and Print, and I'm not actually going to print this, but I can set the preferences of my print from portrait to landscape. I might even change the paper. So for example, if I'm really never going to print this, I'm always going to output this to Excel, I might go to like an A4 page, you know, something that's much wider to give myself more room. But in this case, I'll keep it as a letter, 8.5 by 11, but we will landscape it. So that's going to give me a couple of extra inches. So if I move that out of the way, notice now I've got up to 11 inches of real estate. So I'm going to drag that period quantity sold, and I'm going to put it next to my quantity sold. And I'm going to turn off the suppression. So now when I preview this report, notice in Crystal says, okay, you've added a parameter. I need to know the value of that parameter. And with date parameters, they're a little bit different when you enter them in Crystal than they will be in Counterpoint. Notice the formatting is year, month, day. In Counterpoint, you'll actually have a drop-down calendar view. So just enter a year of time frame. Okay, so notice my quantity sold has 4 and 9 and 33, but during the period, that date is not within the period, so it's outputting a 0. If we want to prove that theory, we can actually drop in the posting date and put it right next to it. And my period was in 2015, and so notice all the sales from 2012 are not included. So when I total that column, it's not going to include these numbers in my total, which I don't want. So I'm going to turn that suppression back on just to hide that. And so this quantity sold, I no longer want to sum the quantity sold. I want to sum the period quantity sold. So if I right click on the field, I can edit the summary. So instead of deleting it and building a new summary, I can edit the summary and change what field I'm summarizing. And I would do that with all of them. I'm not sure which one's faster, deleting it and starting over or modifying the existings, but if you've got formattings and things like that, this might be a better route. So now if I preview that report, I've got sales, and notice if an item wasn't sold during the period, I still display what was on hand, what's on hand right now, and what the retail value of that inventory is, which is what I wanted all along. So next up. Other things I might do with that parameter is I might include that in my title. So let's rename this from COVID-1 to on hand. So I'm going to give a title of on-hand inventory with sales from, and now I can drop in that starting and that end date into that text field. So when I look at this report a week later, I know what the date range is that was entered when they ran the report. So I just drag that into my text field. and then I can put text to separate my two dates. So I've got a space in the word to and another space. And now if I preview that, it displays my date range. If I want to format any of that embedded fields within text, if I click on the field within the text, if I right click, I can format the start date, and I can change how I want to format that date. If I want to put the day of the week and the month and the year, I can. I can do the same thing if I embed numbers or other text fields. That's an example of a parameter that we're really using as a filter without modifying the join type. I want to add one more parameter. So when I'm looking at this report, I might want to get rid of the location-specific information, but just have the item totals. But I want to give the end user the ability to see it with the location detail or without the location detail. So rather than creating two separate reports that I have to maintain, I'm going to build a parameter that says location detail. And so if I click on parameters and we add a new parameter, I'll add a parameter called location detail. And this is not going to be a date. This is going to be a Boolean. So Boolean is a fancy word, great cocktail party word, that means true or false, yes or no. And so when we drop in a parameter that's a Boolean, when the end user runs the report in Counterpoint, they actually get a checkbox that they can check to indicate yes or no. So the default value is set as true. I could flip that and make it false. And so my prompting text might be display location detail. And so on my design tab, on group footer 3, which is displaying my location detail, I might want to suppress that. And so if I go into my section expert, Ryan, is there a question? I'm hearing a chirp, maybe from Mark. Mark, did you have a question? I unmuted you.
He had his hand raised. I've had a hard time unmuting people. It might be easier, Mark, if you could put it in the Q&A at the bottom. We did have an earlier question from Anonymous asking if you could cover the Data Explorer connection.
Data Explorer connection. I'm assuming what you mean by that is the database expert?
Possibly.
Where we have access to all of the tables that Counterpoint provides. So within the database expert, I have in my history, I have a connection to my database, or a couple of them. And within that, I have my database, and from that, under DBO or database owner, I have access to all of the tables and views and stored procedures. Stored procedures are a little bit of an advanced monster. We won't go into that, but within tables, we have access to all of the tables that Counterpoint provides. We have access to the views that Counterpoint provides. And if you build your own custom views in SQL, those will be accessible here as well to either pre-summarize or join data. Views can be an effective tool for that. So for example, if I wanted to drag in, maybe I want my category description. Some people have code numbers for categories and they need to translate that to a category description. So if I wanted to add the category code table to my report. I can select it, and on the links tab, and if I click links up on top or click OK, either way I'm going to get to that links tab, and I'm going to have to link in whatever I've added. And in this case, it was smart enough to say, oh, the category code over here matches the category code over here, and that's how I'm going to link them. And if I need to change the link type, like I've done between the inventory table and the ticket history table, notice here there's squares on the ends of the links, as opposed to here there's an arrow on the end of the link indicating it's an outer join. And so to change a link, if you click on the link and then right click, you can select link options and change the join type. And I can do the same thing here. If I click on the link, I can either right click and choose link options, or once it's selected, there's a link options button over here. Same screen, and I can change it from an inner join to a left outer join. And when I click off of the link, it updates the link and indicates it's with the arrow that it's an outer join. And now that I've added a new table to the report, in my database fields, I've got my category code, and I can drag in the description if I wanted to. So I was adding a parameter for location detail. And what I want to do is in my group footer 3, which is my location group, I want to suppress that if the end user, when they run the report, doesn't check the box for location detail. So if I go to my section expert, and I can click on the little button here to do it, or I can right click and choose section expert. And so if I look at group footer 3, the location detail, I'm going to say, let's suppress that section. We're going to hide it. And if I click on the formula button, I can build a condition as to when I hide it. And so if my parameter, and notice all of these have symbols on them. Question mark indicates a parameter, X1 indicates it's a formula, the symbol indicates it's a running total. So if I choose location detail equals false, and notice false lights up as true in blue, so with the word true. So if the condition, that field is false because the end user didn't check the box, that condition will evaluate as true and therefore suppress the row. So now if I preview this report, I've already entered the starting and the ending date, but I haven't indicated whether or not I want to see the location detail. So I have to choose that now. So if I choose false, notice it compresses the report and eliminates the location detail. If I refresh the report and prompt for new parameters, there's going to be 3 parameters there, the dates that I've entered previously, and I can change false to true to see how that works. Another way you can suppress that information but still keep it there is, instead of using the suppress function, there's a hide function. And the way the hide works is, I'll delete this real quick. Notice the hide doesn't have the formula option. So if we choose to hide it, it automatically hides it. But if we double click, it'll expand and display all of the information, the location specific information. And in Counterpoint, it would actually just expand down the page. It wouldn't open up on a new tab. But I want to keep that in there using the parameter field. So I'll go back to my section expert, and in my location group, footer, I'm going to suppress that. And we're going to suppress that when the location detail equals false. Now we're missing a couple fields here. I could go back and backfill them in. So for example, the gross margin percentage and the quantity sold, I probably want to build those in. So if I want to build the sum of the period quantity sold into my item footer, since I removed the column up in the detail section, if I click on the summary button to insert a summary, I can insert a summary based on the period quantity sold, and that's going to be a sum. Notice there's all kinds of crazy calculations you can build here. I think you can actually calculate tangents and cosines and all kinds of other things in Crystal if you really wanted to. But I'm going to summarize the period quantity sold, and I'm going to place that summary into my item group footer 2, which is where it's missing right now. And I'll drag it over into the column.
Hi, John. Danielle would like to know, how do you add or remove an order by dropdown?
In Counterpoint? That's a great question, and we're going to hit that in about 2 minutes.
All right, thanks.
And I'm very impressed that somebody jumps ahead of me like that. That's great.
Thanks.
Actually, the next thing I need to cover, but I wanted to show what she demonstrate what she's asking. So I'm going to save this report. Save there. And we're going to park Crystal for a minute. And we're going to jump over to Counterpoint. And I'm going to go into my menu codes. And I'm going to add this report to my Counterpoint menu, which is something everybody should know how to do if you're actually going to build reports and make them accessible to people. The easiest way to make them accessible is put them on their menu. So on my manager menu, I've got a folder here called the new folder. And I'm going to add that COVID report to my new folder. So if I right click on the new folder and select new and menu item, I can title the report. And so the command type is going to be a custom report. And if I hit the ellipse for the report, there's my COVID-1 report. And so when I close this, save and save, in my new folder, there's a COVID report. Now, the question is, how do we get rid of this order by? Well, the bigger question is, what is it doing there, and what impact is that going to have? And the obvious question is, how do I get rid of that? Is because it causes a problem. So if I execute this report, notice I get a pop-up for my parameters, and notice here I'm entering them in month, day, year, and you can select from the calendar. And here's the error I was describing. And what this error means is if you put certain tables on your report, and the item table is probably the biggest guilty party. The customer table is probably the second biggest guilty party for causing this issue. Counterpoint says, oh, you might want to sort that data by some of the more common sort methods for that specific table. So with the item table, it gives you the ability to sort the data by category or vendor or description or item number. The problem is when we built this report in Crystal, we grouped our data. So when we grouped it by category and then grouped it by item and then grouped it by location, we need to sort it or order it the way it's grouped. So the error message we're getting from Counterpoint is ordering it by item number conflicts with our report layout. So we need to get rid of that order by statement from Counterpoint. So let's answer the question. I've dodged it enough, right? So if I modify any one of these formulas, I'm really not going to change the formula, but I'm just using this as a way to navigate to a place where I can get rid of that order by statement. Oh, and the other thing that I want to do as I'm doing this, I'm going to kill two birds with one stone. When I run this report, notice I'm getting a separate pop-up box for the parameters. I want to include these parameters as a tab on my report layout, the same way you see a parameters tab on most of the Counterpoint reports. And I add that parameter tab really the same way I get rid of that order by. So in the formula fields, if I edit one of these formulas, and it doesn't matter which one I edit, I'm not changing any of this stuff. What I'm doing is I'm going to the selection formula. And I'm drilling down to the record selection. And in the record selection, I'm going to add a couple of comments. So these comments are not viewed by Crystal Report Writer, but Counterpoint picks them up and says, oh, I got the message, I know how to handle that. And so the comments that I'm going to put in are show order by. So we want to eliminate that choice or that option. So we're going to say show order by none, which means there will not be an order by drop-down option. There are other ways of using this where you can actually limit what the order by choices are, but the way the report is laid out, we don't want the end user to change the order by. And the other function we're going to put in here is prompt for parameters. And I've always thought this was backwards, but we're going to say no. We do not want to prompt for parameters, which means we're going to get rid of that extra pop-up window where we enter the date and whether or not we want the location detail. So if I save and close that and save my report, and go back to Counterpoint, notice now I get a parameters tab for my dates, and I get the typical drop-down box. And I have the same standard Windows, Counterpoint shortcuts for entering dates. So Y would be the beginning of the year, or M for the beginning of the month, or T for today. So all of the same shortcuts apply. And notice it says play location detail instead of display location detail. I might want to change that, get rid of the word display or abbreviate something there. But if I uncheck the box and preview the report, sorry, the report popped up on my other monitor. Because I unchecked the box, it did not display the location detail, but I didn't get the error message with the order by. And if I run it again with that checked, it runs with location detail. That's an example of a couple of parameters, how you can use them for filtering data within a column without affecting the link, as well as using parameters to print or suppress data on the report. There's one more I want to show you. So if I run this report, notice it comes up with tabs for the item and inventory and ticket history and category. If I want to eliminate some of these tab options, maybe I want to get rid of the ticket history line tab, because if somebody filters using this tab, it will restrict what data appears on the report. So for example, if I run this for a date range of year to date, and regardless of what I put in here for a starting date and an end date, notice I get no data because it's filtering my ticket history, looking for sales year to date. And since there are no sales year to date in this database, it's not gonna, there's nothing to link to the item and inventory tables. If I drop that filter off, I'm going to get my sales history and my on-hand inventory back. So since I don't want somebody making that same mistake, I want to get rid of this ticket history line tab. And I also probably want to get rid of the item category tab. So if I go back to my report, and I go back to the selection formula and the record selection, where I put in those two comments, I'm going to put in one more, which is going to be show filters. And I always recommend doing this in uppercase. And so I'm only going to show the item tab and the inventory tab. So now if I go back to the report, notice I've eliminated those extra tabs. So I've simplified it for the end user. And those comments and the spelling of them are all detailed in the Word doc that Ryan's sent out.
Yes, I sent that Word document with Monday's recording, and then I'll send it again today with today's recording to anyone who has registered. If you weren't registered for Monday and you'd like the document, please let me know.
There we go. So I think we've beat up this report about as much as we possibly can. Well, no, actually, we can put a couple more things into this. Two more topics I want to talk about with this report while we've got a whole bunch of mess in here. And this is a common tactic that Counterpoint or NCR Synchronix Radiant uses a lot. And that is embedding sub reports in the report. And so somebody asked the question about the database expert. Well, I'm going to drop in another table on this report to really mess this up. And the table I'm going to drop in is the vendor item table. So I've got what I sell, how many I have at all my different locations, and I've got some sales history information. Maybe I also want to know, who do I buy this product from and what are their various costs? So that would be in the vendor item table. So I'm going to link that in. So I'm going to link my item table to my vendor item table. So linking, and it linked it correctly based on the item number in the item table to the item number in the vendor item table. And again, I'm going to change this to a left outer join because I might have items that don't have a vendor item record. Maybe they're non-inventory parts that I want to include the sales history for. There we go. And so if I go to my design tab, I'm going to add another section in my item section. So beneath my item numbers and descriptions and prices and other detail, I'm going to insert a section below. So notice I have section 2A and section 2B. Both of those are considered part of the item group header. And the reason we might have multiple item sections or multiple category sections is I might want to conditionally suppress a row, or it might just be easier for me to line up data. So in this section of 2B, I'm going to drag out my vendor number, and I want my unit cost. So now if I preview this report, need to find a product I buy from multiple vendors. I don't have one, so I'll add one real quick for these golf balls. So these golf balls I normally buy from Top Flight, but I might also be able to get them from an alternate vendor. I'm not sure why it's not coming with a second vendor. Bear with me 1 second. Must be because I put it in a different group. Let's move that into the details section. There we go. So notice it's displaying, and it's split onto a separate page. But here's my XLT item, and notice it's sourced from Pinnacle and from Top Flight. And at the location, even though there's a cost difference between the two of them, it's going to increase my quantity sold, or essentially double my quantity sold, because there's two vendors. And it could have the same impact on my on-hands or my retail values. They probably won't, since those are running totals, but since the quantity sold is a summary, having additional rows inserted will multiply or amplify my totals. And so as a workaround, we never really drag that additional table in that manner. And another example of this would be payment history on sales history. If I buy 3 items on a ticket and I pay for it with cash, and then I get change back, I've got 3 line items and 2 payment records. And Crystal Report Writer is going to link the 2 payment records to the 3 line items, which is going to give me 6 output records, which is going to, again, impact my totals. So a way around that is to insert a sub report. So in my, I'll put it up here and back up in 2B, I'm going to insert a sub report. And we'll call this vendor item. And here I'll run the report wizard because I only want to drag out 2 fields. And I'm going to select my vendor item table. And from the vendor item table, I want the vendor number and I want the unit cost. Now in this, I might have also linked the vendor so I could get the vendor name. So if I do that, I have to link the 2 tables based on the vendor number. So the wizard did it automatically. So I want the vendor name. I've got the unit cost and the vendor number. So essentially, notice this big box I'm dragging onto my report. And this vendor item sub-report positions itself on the report like a picture, like an image. And so what we need to do is we need to link our primary report to the sub-report. So if I right-click on my sub-report, I can change the sub-report links, and I can link based on the item number. So if I select the item number, I'm passing the item number as a variable to the sub-report, or as a parameter, and it's going to filter the sub-report based on that item number. And so the other thing I probably want to do here is go back and get rid of my vendor item table from my primary report. So now if I run that report, notice there's a big block here which has the vendor item information. And we can make that look a little bit prettier. So in that sub-report, I might not want the print date and all this other space around it. So if I go into my section expert, I can delete section B, footer B, and I might suppress the header and the footer. And I might shrink those as small as I can make them. Now if I go back and preview the report, notice it's got one line. And notice there's a box around it. We can format that as well. So if we format the sub report, we can get rid of the border. And essentially what I'm trying to do is make it look less like a picture and just more like another row of data on my report. And if I go to my last page where I had 2 suppliers for the same product, notice they're both within the same box because it's pulling that data from the subreport. Subreports can slow down your primary report. They work great on invoices and purchase order forms, but if you're doing a ticket history report with thousands of rows of data, that means it's going to have to execute that subreport thousands of times. So I'd be sparing in how I use that, but it is an effective strategy in certain circumstances. Just going to go back and resuppress my detail section to trim that report back down the way we had it before. Just from a formatting standpoint, notice the pound symbols down here. That's just indicating that I haven't allocated enough space for the column. Need to drag it out a little bit wider so it fits. So I want to park this report and talk about modifying existing reports and forms in Counterpoint. So I'll leave this one open, but if I go to File and Open, if I browse to my server's Counterpoint directory, within the top level directory, I have both a system folder, which are kind of contain all of the defaults for Counterpoint, including all the default reports and default invoice forms and purchase order forms. And then I have a company folder, which contains all of my modifications to those standards. So if I'm going to modify a report, I usually recommend you take a quick look in the reports folder to see if you've modified the report previously, because if you go back and modify the stock one, you'll lose all your previous changes. But I'm going to go back to a stock report. Actually, in this case, I'm going to do a stock invoice. So if I go to my system folder and I go to my PS forms, so there's both a PS form, which is point of sale forms. That's invoices, receipts, quotes, holds, layaways, order forms, and a reports folder, which contains purchase orders, purchase requests, returns to vendors, all of the inventory reports and sales history reports. But in this case, we'll go to PS forms, and I'm going to modify the invoice1.rpt. That's kind of our standard invoice report. So when I open that, it warns me that I have to save it to a new name or to a new directory. And so as I make changes to this, when I save it, I can't save it because it's write protected in its current location. I have to save it as something else. And I want to save that into my Red Sox folder, configuration, and PS forms. And I want to save it here. And this allows me to keep the same file name, which means I don't have to update any form groups. Counterpoint's going to automatically look in the Red Sox folder, looking for a copy of invoice 1 first. If it doesn't find it, it'll use the one in the system folder. And so now that I've got the report open, notice I've got page headers, and in this instance, there's 10 or 15 different layers of page headers. And then we get into group headers and details, and then group footers, and then report footers. Pretty much everything we've covered, just the invoice has a lot more detail and a lot more conditional detail. So they break things up into sections just for formatting purposes. So one of the things that I might want to do on this particular invoice form is drop an image or a logo. So if I go to my section expert, I want to drop a section up above page header A. And notice it dropped it below it. So if I go back to my section expert, I can click on page header B, and I can move that up so it's the top. And so now I've got a blank section where I can drop something in. And I'm going to insert a picture. I've got a picture in my archive that I'm going to use, which is from the Football Hall of Fame. And I can drag that a little bit bigger so it formats correctly. And so notice this is kind of sitting up on top of the very invoice. Well, I want to blend that picture into the invoice itself. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to that section expert. And my page header A section, which is where the image is, I'm going to choose to underlay the following sections. And by doing that, this section, which is about 3/4 of an inch tall, is actually not going to take up any space on the page. It's going to print next to either the word invoice or quote or hold, and then it's going to print next to the store description and address. So notice I want to make sure that this line gives me enough space, and it looks like it does. It's going to appear literally right next to the store description and address. And again, when I save that, it'll save back to my my company folder. And you'll see a lot of times when you're modifying something that was write protected, you usually have to change the file name to be allowed to save it, and then do a save as and save it back as the original file. And it'll allow you to save it. Not sure why it locks that file name, but it does. If you're modifying reports that have been modified previously from a housekeeping standpoint, I recommend making backups of them. So I might take this invoice 2 and rename it as invoice backup. So if I mess up, I can delete my modifications and revert back to my backup copy. I don't have to restore backups of the top level directory or anything else. I want to go back to the report we laid out, and somebody asked on Monday about creating reports that you can export to Excel. From a design standpoint, this report, if we export it to Excel, well, I'll show you what it looks like. If I export this as an Excel or a data only, Excel's going to put all kinds of columns around so here's what it looks like in Excel. Pretty ugly. So from a formatting standpoint, if the goal is to output this into Excel, you want to minimize all of this blank space. You want to repeat your item numbers and your descriptions on all of your rows, because as you resort that in Excel, you want to keep the location and the totals along with the description. So from a layout standpoint, I wouldn't have a group header I would suppress this entire section, and I'd probably move the descriptions down into the footers. And make them fit. And then I would suppress this group header 2A. And I'd probably eliminate this whole subreport. And do the same thing with the category total. If you're going to move that to Excel, you're probably going to do pivot tables or something in Excel for that. So I'd eliminate that as well. So this data is going to be a little more consistent when it outputs to Excel and will allow you to create columns in a more consistent manner. So once again, I've taken us right up to 11:59. I don't know how I did that. Are there any questions that anybody would like to go back and recover, or anything that I was confusing with?
Someone just asked if we could go over SQL reports in a different webinar at some point. So it just says anonymous attendee. So we will add that to our list of webinar suggestions.
Yes, and the handout actually has a couple of instances of some SQL stored procedure reports. If you get towards the end of it, there's some instances of some SQL code to build stored procedures that can be used with reports. And we have done that for, I don't think we've done that as a webinar. We've done that for specific end users. I would probably plan that as like a 3-hour webinar at least. It's a pretty complicated topic, but yes, we can do that. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye.